The Late Bronze Age collapse was a transition in the Aegean region, Southwestern Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean from the Late Bronze Age to the Early Iron Age that historians, such as Amos and Leonard believe was violent, sudden and culturally disruptive. The palace economy of the Aegean region and Anatolia which characterized the Late Bronze Age was replaced, after a hiatus, by the isolated village cultures of the Greek Dark Ages. Between 1206 and 1150 BCE, the cultural collapse of the Mycenaean kingdoms, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia and Syria, and the new kingdom of Egypt in Syria and Canaan interrupted trade routes and severely reduced literacy. In the first phase of this period, almost every city between Pylos and Gaza was violently destroyed, and often left unoccupied thereafter. Examples include Hattusa, Mycenae, and Ugarit. The gradual end of the Dark Age that ensued saw the eventual rise of settled Syro-Hittite states in Cilicia and Syria, Aramean kingdoms of the mid-10th century BC in the Levant, and the eventual rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Regional evidence. Anatolia. Prior to the Bronze Age collapse, Anatolia was dominated by a number of Indo-European peoples, Luans, Hittites, Mycenae, and Mycenaean Greeks, together with the Semitic Assyrians. From the 17th century BC, the Mycenae formed a ruling class over the Hurrians, an ancient indigenous Caucasian people who spoke a Hurro-Eurasian language isolate. Similarly, the Hittites absorbed the Hattians, a people speaking a language which may have been of the North Caucasian group. Every Anatolian site that was important during the preceding Late Bronze Age shows a destruction layer, and it appears that here civilization did not recover to the level of the Indo-European Hittites for another 1,000 years. Hattusa's, the Hittite capital, was burned probably by Cascians, possibly aided by the Phrygians abandoned, and never reoccupied. Karaun was burned and the corpses left unburied. The Hittite Empire was destroyed by the Indo-European-speaking Phrygians and by the Semitic-speaking Arameans. The Trojan city of Troy was destroyed at least twice, before being abandoned until Roman times. The Phrygians had arrived probably over the Bosphorus in the 13th century BCE, and laid waste to the Hittite Empire, before being checked by the Assyrians in the early Iron Age of the 9th century BCE. Other groups of Indo-European warriors followed into the region, most prominently the Armenians, and even later, by the Cimmerians, and Scythians. The Semitic Arameans, Kartvelian-speaking Colchians, and Hurro-Urartuans also made an appearance in parts of the region. Cyprus. The catastrophe separates late Cypriot II from the LCII period, with the sacking and burning of Enkelme, Kishon, and Cinder, which may have occurred twice before those sites were abandoned. During the reign of the Hittite king Tuthel IV, the island was briefly invaded by the Hittites either to secure the copper resource or as a way of preventing piracy. Shortly afterwards, the island was reconquered by his son around 1200 BCE. Some towns show traces of destruction at the end of LCIIC. Whether or not this is really an indication of a Mycenaean invasion is contested. Originally, two waves of destruction, circa 1230 BCE by the Sea peoples and circa 1190 BCE by Aegean refugees have been proposed. The smaller settlements of Iaios Dimitrios and Kokkinokrimnos, as well as a number of other sites, were abandoned, but do not show traces of destruction. Kokkinokrimnos was a short-lived settlement, where various caches concealed by smiths have been found. That no one ever returned to reclaim the treasures suggests that they were killed or enslaved. Recovery only occurred in the early Iron Age with Phoenician and Greek settlement. Syria. Ancient Syria had been initially dominated by a number of indigenous Semitic-speaking peoples. The Canaanites, the Amorites, and cities of Ebla and Ugarit were prominent among these. Prior to and during the Bronze Age collapse, Syria became a battleground between the empires of the Hittites, Assyrians, Mycenae and Egyptians, and the coastal regions came under attack from the Sea peoples. From the 13th century BCE, the Arameans came to prominence in Syria, and the region outside of the Phoenician coastal areas eventually became Aramaic-speaking. Syrian sites previously showed evidence of trade links with Mesopotamia, Egypt and the Aegean in the Late Bronze Age. Evidence at Ugarit shows that the destruction there occurred after the reign of Meneptah and even the fall of Chancellor Bey. The last Bronze Age king of the Semitic state of Ugarit, Amrapi, was a contemporary of the Hittite king Suppiluliuma II. The exact dates of his reign are unknown. However, a letter by the king is preserved on one of the clay tablets found baked in the conflagration of the destruction of the city. Amrapi stresses the seriousness of the crisis faced by many Levantine states from invasion by the advancing Sea peoples in a dramatic response to a plea for assistance from the king of Alasia. Amrapi highlights the desperate situation Ugarit faced in letter RS 18.147. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it, the 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. Unfortunately for Ugarit, no help arrived and Ugarit was burned to the ground at the end of the Bronze Age. Its destruction levels contained late Helladic IIB but no LHEic. Therefore, the date of the destruction is important for the dating of the LHIIC phase. Since an Egyptian sword bearing the name of Pharaoh Meneptah was found in the destruction levels, 1190 BCE was taken as the date for the beginning of the LHEic. A cuneiform tablet found in 1986 shows that Ugarit was destroyed after the death of Meneptah. It is generally agreed that Ugarit had already been destroyed by the 8th year of Ramesses I. 1178 BCE. These letters on clay tablets found baked in the conflagration of the destruction of the city speak of attack from the sea, and a letter from Al-Ashir speaks of cities already being destroyed from attackers who came by sea. It also speaks of the Ugarit fleet being absent, patrolling the Lycian coast. The West Semitic Arameans eventually superseded the earlier Amorites, Canaanites and people of Ugarit, to whom they were ethno-linguistically related. The Arameans came to dominate the region both politically and militarily from the mid-11th century BCE until the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the late 10th century BCE, after which the entire region fell to Assyria. Southern Levant, Egyptian evidence shows that, from the reign of Hormp, wandering Shasu were more problematic than the earlier Apura. Ramesses II campaigned against them, pursuing them as far as Moab, where he established a fortress, after the near collapse at the Battle of Kadesh. During the reign of Meneptah, the Shasu threatened the way of Horus north from Gaza. Evidence shows that Dur-Allah was destroyed after the reign of Queen Twizrit. The destroyed site of Lachish was briefly reoccupied by squatters and an Egyptian garrison, during the reign of Ramesses III. All centers along a coastal route from Gaza northward were destroyed, and evidence shows Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Akko, and Jaffa were burned and not reoccupied for up to 30 years. Inland Hazor, Bethel, Beit Shemesh, Eglon, Debir, and other sites were destroyed. Refugees escaping the collapse of coastal centers may have fused with incoming nomadic and Anatolian elements to begin the growth of terraced hillside hamlets in the highland region that was associated with the later development of the Hebrews. During the reign of Ramesses III, Philistines were allowed to resettle the coastal strip from Gaza to Joppa, Denians settled from Joppa to Acre, and Jekka and Acre. These sites quickly achieved independence as the tale of Weneman shows. Greece. None of the Mycenaean palaces of the Late Bronze Age survived, with destruction being heaviest at palaces and fortified sites. Up to 90% of small sites in the Peloponnese were abandoned, suggesting a major depopulation. The End Bronze Age collapse marked the start of what has been called the Greek Dark Ages, which lasted for more than 400 years. Other cities, like Athens, continued to be occupied, but with a more local sphere of influence, limited evidence of trade and an impoverished culture, from which it took centuries to recover. Mesopotamia, the Middle Assyrian Empire controlled colonies in Anatolia, which came under attack from the Mashki. Tiglath-Pileser I was able to defeat and repel these attacks. The Assyrian Empire survived intact throughout much of this period, with Assyria dominating and often ruling Babylonia directly, controlling southeast and southwestern Anatolia, northwestern Iran and much of northern and central Syria and Canaan, as far as the Mediterranean and Cyprus. The Arameans and Phrygians were subjected, and Assyria and its colonies were not threatened by the Sea Peoples. However, after the death of Tiglath-Pileser in 1076 BCE, Assyria withdrew to its natural borders in northern Mesopotamia. Assyria retained a stable monarchy, the best army in the world and an efficient civil administration, thus enabling it to survive the Bronze Age collapse intact and, from the late 10th century BCE, it once more began to assert itself internationally. However, the situation in Babylonia was very different. After the Assyrian withdrawal, new groups of Semites, such as the Arameans and later Chaldeans and Sutians, spread unchecked into Babylonia, and the control by its weak kings barely extended beyond the city limits of Babylon. Babylon was sacked by the Elamites under Shutruk-Nakhunte, and lost control of the Dilla River Valley to Assyria. Egypt. After apparently surviving for a while, the Egyptian Empire collapsed in the mid-12th century BCE. Previously, the Meneptah stele spoke of attacks from Libyans, with associated people of Iqesh, Shekelesh, Lucca, Shardana and Tersha or Teresh, possibly Troas, and a Canaanite revolt, in the cities of Ashkelon, Yinom and the people of Israel. A second attack during the reign of Rameses III involved Peliset, Pshka, Shardana and Ennion. Conclusion. Robert Druce describes the collapse as the worst disaster in ancient history, even more calamitous than the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. A number of people have spoken of the cultural memories of the disaster as stories of a lost golden age. Hesiod, for example, spoke of ages of gold, silver and bronze, separated from the modern harsh cruel world of the Age of Iron by the Age of Heroes. Possible causes of collapse. There are various theories put forward to explain the situation of collapse, many of them compatible with each other. Environmental, climate change. Changes in climate similar to the Younger Dryas period or the Little Ice Age punctuate human history. The local effects of these changes may cause crop failures in multiple consecutive years, leading to warfare as a last-ditch effort at survival. The triggers for climate change are still debated, but ancient peoples could neither have predicted nor coped with substantial climate changes. Volcanoes. The Hekla 3 eruption approximately coincides with this period and, while the exact date is under considerable dispute, one group calculated the date specifically to be 1159 BC and implicated the eruption in the collapse in Egypt. Drought. Using the Palmer Drought Index for 35 Greek, Turkish, and Middle Eastern weather stations, it was shown that a drought of the kind that persisted from January 1972 would have affected all of the sites associated with the Late Bronze Age collapse. Drought could have easily precipitated or hastened socio-economic problems and led to wars. More recently it has been shown how the diversion of midwinter storms, from the Atlantic to north of the Pyrenees and the Alps, bringing wetter conditions to Central Europe but drought to the eastern Mediterranean, was associated with the Late Bronze Age collapse. Pollen and sediment cores from the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee show that there was a period of severe drought at the start of the collapse. Cultural, migrations and raids. Ekrem Gustav Lehmann and Fritz Skarchemir following the views of Gaston Maspero have argued for this view. Evidence includes the widespread findings of Nor-2-type swords throughout the region, and Egyptian records of invading northerners from all the lands. The Ugarit correspondence at the time mentions invasions by tribes of the mysterious Sea Peoples, who appear to have been a disparate mix of Luans, Greeks and Canaanites, among others. Equally, the last Greek Linear B documents in the Aegean reported a large rise in piracy, slave raiding and other attacks, particularly around Anatolia. Later fortresses along the Libyan coast, constructed and maintained by the Egyptians after the reign of Rameses II, were built to reduce raiding. This theory is strengthened by the fact that the collapse coincides with the appearance in the region of many new ethnic groups. These include Indo-European tribes, such as the Phrygians, Proto-Armenians, Medes, Persians, Cimmerians, Lydians and Scythians, as well as the Pontic-speaking Colchians, Hurro-Urartuans and Iranian Sarmatians. These groups settled or emerged in the Caucasus, Iran and Anatolia. Thracians, Macedonians and Dorian Greeks seem to have arrived at this time possibly from the north, usurping the earlier Greeks of Mycenae and Achaea. There also seems to have been widespread migration of Semitic peoples, such as Arameans, Chaldeans and Sutians possibly from the southeast. The ultimate reasons for these migrations could include drought, developments in warfare weaponry, earthquakes, or other natural disasters, meaning that the migrations theory is not necessarily incompatible with the other theories mentioned here. Ironworking. The Bronze Age collapse may be seen in the context of a technological history that saw the slow, comparatively continuous spread of ironworking technology in the region, beginning with precocious ironworking in what is now Bulgaria and Romania in the 13th and 12th centuries BC. Leonard R. Palmer suggested that iron, while inferior to bronze weapons, was in more plentiful supply and so allowed larger armies of iron users to overwhelm the smaller armies of bronze using Marion carotry. This argument has been weakened of late with the finding that the shift to iron occurred after the collapse, not before. It now seems that the disruption of long-distance trade, an aspect of systems collapse, cut easy supplies of tin, making bronze impossible to make. Older implements were recycled and then iron substitutes were used. Changes in warfare. Robert Drews argues that the appearance of massed infantry, using newly developed weapons and armor, such as cast rather than forged spearheads and long swords, a revolutionizing cut and thrust weapon, and javelins, and the appearance of bronze foundries, suggest that mass production of bronze artifacts was suddenly important in the Aegean. Such new weaponry, in the hands of large numbers of running skirmishers, who could swarm and cut down a chariot army, would destabilize states that were based upon the use of chariots by the ruling class and precipitate an abrupt social collapse as raiders began to conquer, loot, and burn the cities. General systems collapse. A general systems collapse has been put forward as an explanation for the reversals in culture that occurred between the Urnfield culture of the 12th–13th centuries BC and the rise of the Celtic Hallstatt culture in the 9th and 10th centuries BC. This theory may, however, simply raise the question of whether this collapse was the cause of, or the effect of, the Bronze Age collapse being discussed. General systems collapse theory, pioneered by Joseph Tainter, hypothesizes how social declines in response to complexity may lead to a collapse resulting in simpler forms of society. In the specific context of the Middle East, a variety of factors including population growth, soil degradation, drought, cast bronze weapon and iron production technologies could have combined to push the relative price of weaponry to a level unsustainable for traditional warrior aristocracies. In complex societies that were increasingly fragile and less resilient, this combination of factors may have contributed to the collapse. The growing complexity and specialization of the Late Bronze Age political, economic, and social organization in Carroll Thomas and Craig Conant's phrases a weakness that could explain such a widespread collapse that was able to render the Bronze Age civilizations incapable of recovery. The critical flaws of the Late Bronze Age are its centralization, specialization, complexity and top-heavy political structure. These flaws then revealed themselves through socio-political factors, fragility of all kingdoms, demographic crises, and wars between states. Other factors that could have placed increasing pressure on the fragile kingdoms include piratical disturbances of maritime trade by the sea peoples, drought, crop failures, famine, Dorian migration or invasion. A more speculative theory is Jane's bicameralism, which claims that the complexity of society at this time called for a large-scale shift in human cognition, from instinctive and religious behavior to logical reasoning. This is still a fringe theory, but has recently attracted the attention of several scholars and conferences. Links to religious texts. The collapse occurred at around the time that Jewish and Christian scholars place the character of Moses. Their texts describe a series of events similar to natural disasters and events in Egypt at this time, followed by a back-migration of Semitic people from Egypt back into Canaan. The Harris Papyrus tells of the expulsion of Asiatics by Sitnacht and the chaos at the end of the 19th dynasty. The Greek Iliad's historic accuracy is still disputed, but it is currently accepted that its core events are related to Troy 7, also around the time of the collapse. See also Greek Dark Ages a Euro period following the Bronze Age collapse, First Intermediate Period of Egypt a Euro a similar period in Egypt, some 1,400 years earlier, references. Further reading